architecture students and others in this building. I'm glad you're all to come. We have a special treat for you today. I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, but I first want to note that he will be speaking from about 4 to 5 today. And then I want to invite you all to go outside for a delectable reception hosted by our Associated Students for Historic Preservation. They have a long-standing reputation for culinary excellence. Okay? We are fortunate to have with us this afternoon one of the top restoration architects in the Midwest. Gunny Harboe, AIA, is here with us. Beginning this month, Gunny is heading his own firm, Harboe Architects in Chicago, and he's specializing in historic preservation and sustainable design. Prior to that, he spent 17 years in the Clear Architects of Chicago, where he managed all the firm's projects involving preservation, restoration, and rehabilitation of historic buildings. Gunny holds an MArch degree from MIT, and while he was at MIT, he also studied at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen, Denmark. He also holds a Master of Science degree in Historic Preservation from Columbia University, and a Bachelor's degree in History from Brown. He is, in addition, taking training at the Rome Center, its full name of which is the International Center for the Study of Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, which is why it's called the Rome Center. Gunny is well known for his restoration of Burnham and Root's Rookery Building and the restoration and rehabilitation of the same firm's Reliance Building in Chicago. And the Reliance Building, as some of you know if you've been out there, is now the Hotel Burnham. For both projects, Gunny and his firm received National Honor Awards from the American Institute of Architects and from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I want to say parenthetically that about 10 years ago, Gunny was here in the same room talking to us about the restoration of the Rookery Building, which was a delight. And those of you who've been to Chicago and have seen it, I think will agree. And if you haven't seen it, you should go to the Rookery Building and note the sensuous colors and fabric that have been brought to light in that restoration. In 1996, he gave our preservation students, we're up in Chicago, a tour of the Reliance Building during its rehab. A couple of us were, he was nice enough to give chunks of terracotta, original terracotta from the Reliance Building. I still have my chunk upstairs. More recent projects, all in the Chicago area, include Holabird and Roche's Marquette Building in the Loop, Chicago, Frank Lloyd Wright's Unity Temple, Louis Sullivan's Carson Perry Scott Department Store, Holabird and Root's Chicago Board of Trade Building, and the subject of his lecture this afternoon, Mies van der Rohe's Crown Hall at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And we should note that all these are National Historic Landmarks, so Gunny only works with the highest caliber of historic buildings. Gunny is a past president of the AIA Chicago. He's the current Secretary General of the International Council Monument Sites Initiative on 20th Century Heritage. He's a Vice President of the Landmarks Preservation Council of Illinois and past president of something which I'm going to ask him to explain because I don't know. Docomomo, U.S. He's going to tell you what that stands for. I think it has something to do with recent past, right? Okay. He has been a leader in the recent past movement in the preservation field and has been working at IT&T in Chicago on planning for the restoration of its modern architectural heritage designed by that master modernist, Mies van der Rohe. We all are looking forward to hearing him speak today about that work, Mies and IT&T Restoring Legacy. Will you join me in welcoming?
Can you hear me? Too loud? I'm sorry. Good. Can a little bit. It's a little glary. Well, thank you, Jim. That's probably more than you needed to hear. What's that? This is fine for me. Is okay for everybody? Thank you for inviting me to come and speak to you all today. I enjoyed the time I was here some years ago talking about the Rookery, and this is a very different topic, equally significant building and buildings, because I'm going to talk not just about Crown, but about other work at IIT as well. And certainly a great master architect, and I hope that there's a good number of architecture students in the room who have aspirations of grandeur and like to look up to the masters to get inspiration, and it's certainly an inspiring thing to spend time working on these buildings by a man like Mies, who was really a man of few words, but he spoke grandly in his built work. So I wanted to start a little bit about the whole idea of preserving modernism and where we are today on that. And in a second I'll talk about Docomomo, but you know, when Preservation magazine is devoting full issues to this topic, that it's something that is really here and it is in the minds of the general public, and that it's something that needs to be reckoned with and paid attention to. These are two different issues. One is, of course, a Lever House in New York that was restored, I think, quite well, although they ended up basically replacing the entire skin, which is an issue with these buildings. And then 2 Columbus Circle, which has been quite a controversy and is actually on your left, and is actually undergoing a total redo right now, rehabilitation. There's no restoration, and this was, the building will be there, the frame of the building anyway, but it'll be a totally different look. The group that was referred to before, Docomomo, is an organization that was started in the mid-90s by a couple, or actually in the very early 90s, right around 92, I think, by a couple of Dutchmen who are modernists, and they were very concerned about the losses they were seeing in the great modern heritage that the Dutch have, that these buildings that no one cared about, the Duiker buildings and how would you say it, Oude, and others from the 20s and the 30s. And these things are there, but they were falling apart and in some cases just being sort of demolished by neglect. So they started to gather interest in it, and what was different about this movement from others, and why it appealed to me in a lot of ways, was that it's really more about preserving the ideas of modernism through the buildings as opposed to just a preservation advocacy group. It has evolved from that time, I'd say, to be a little bit more mainstream, if you will, or more sort of what you think of as an advocacy organization, but nonetheless at its core it's about preserving modernist buildings because they represent the ideas behind modernism. As you know, and you've studied in your courses, I'm sure, that when the whole tumult of the early part of the 20th century and the idea of being modern came to being, architecture was certainly maybe even in the forefront, on at least in the art world, as far as creating new environments for the new world that we were embracing. And the modernists were very much a part of that. So Docomomo is about that. It stands for the documentation and conservation of building sites and neighborhoods of the modern movement, thus Docomomo. There is a very active US chapter. It's based in New York, but there are chapters all over the country. You are more than welcome to affiliate with Docomomo Chicago, which is basically the biggest one in the Midwest. There aren't any other active chapters quite yet, although there's interest from a lot of places. And there are chapters all over the country now. It's something that's grown quite a bit. In the, let's see, 2001, I think, or two, when this show happened, or maybe it was only, I don't know, it was 3 years ago, I think. There were 2 big blockbuster shows in New York. One was Mies in Berlin, the other was Mies in America, and they were intentionally held at the same time, sort of parallel exhibits of Mies's great work. And one was at the Whitney and the other was at MoMA. There's 2 large volumes like this thick of the exhibits, of the exhibitions that document the entire work of Mies, and it was really sort of a demonstration that while Mies had never really gone away, he was certainly back in force. And this leads directly to IIT because this was his home and his place of creative talent in the last half of the century, where he was living in New York and so on. And the role of heading up a new school of architecture that was created at the Armour Institute out of two other, the Armour Institute and the, I always forget it, the, another institute, I'm not remembering it. But these two institutions combined to create the Illinois Institute of Technology. And this shows you the area from 1909, and it didn't look this much different when Mies came there. But one of his first, and these are two buildings that are, these are the two only buildings that are left from that period. These are the original buildings of the campus, main hall, and machinery hall. And these, you can see one's from 1893 and the other from 1901. The 1893 building has some very beautiful detailing, similar to the rookery actually. And some of the metalwork is by the same fabricators that did the rookery work. But Mies was given the assignment of not only heading the School of Architecture, but also designing a new campus in this neighborhood. It was an early urban renewal project, you might think of it that way. It was an area that, it wasn't really, quote, a slum, but it was definitely low-income people. African Americans had settled here. They'd moved up in the Great Migration from the South in the 20s and settled largely in this neighborhood. It's right adjacent to Bronzeville, which is now an historic neighborhood in Chicago, which was the center of both economic and cultural life of the African American community in Chicago. And this happened to also be where the Armour Institute was, for the reason that they were trying to provide education to people with less means and so on. And so, again, in the idea of wiping out large urban zones and then rebuilding new was something that was very exciting and very modernist in its concept. And so Mies was asked to do this. This is one of his early sketches planning out how he saw the campus. And this is a photo montage. He loved to work in this medium where he would take a photograph and then cut and paste stuff on these collages, which were very beautiful in their own right, but also very effective in trying to promote his idea. And you can see his image of the campus. And these are just a sequence of what happened. This building here, this is Old Main, and this is the machinery hall. And then those two have remained. They were slated to go, but they never did take them out, which is actually good because they add a nice context to the whole thing. And this shows the development up. I'm sorry, I went too fast. This is how it looked in about 55 with some of the buildings built, and this is it in 67. He was, he had this role of sort of head of the campus while he was at the school. He retired in 58 or 59, I always get that confused as well, from the school, and he stopped doing any work there. But in the time from the 1940s until the late 1950s, he designed 22 buildings on the campus, most of which I think two are gone now. This shows a plan, a master plan that was developed by Dirk Lohan, who is actually Mies's grandson. And this shows how the Institute was looking to change its image. And in fact, they came very close to moving out to the suburbs. They do have a suburban campus, and there was a lot of debate about whether they stay and reinvest in where they were in Chicago, or do they move out. And the Pritzker family made a very large matching grant situation available to them. I can't remember the numbers, but it was quite significant to keep them there. And one of the main things, or the first things they did, is that they had a competition for a new student center. And that's basically right here in the middle of the whole image that you see here. This side of the tracks, this is the L track that runs, can you all see that? That gray stripe runs right down there. And that separates the academic side from the residential side of the campus. The student center is right in the middle. And I assume you all know that Rem Koolhaas won that competition. And I'm not going to talk about that, or I'm not going to talk about the dorms by Helmut because there's no historic aspect, but the Helmut-Jan dorms are just to the south of that. And this is sort of how we got involved initially in anything down there. The Commons building, which was built in '53 and is one of Mies's most significant buildings on the campus, was in fact the original type of building that this new building was going to become. And so they gave REM the site that basically was a large rectangle that incorporated this piece of it in one corner. And is this arrow, can you see this? This is the Commons building here. And then all the rest of this is REM's design. And there was a huge controversy about it. John Vinci, who is the, well, I guess I can say grand old man. He's a great guy, and he was one of the leading preservationists in town for decades, an expert on Sullivan and Mies. He went to IIT. He grew up actually not far from there, and he was outraged. This is a editorial in the Tribune from him about how unsympathetic this whole thing was. And basically what was happening was that the REM building was embracing, I could maybe call it a bear hug of the historic building, and it really wanted just to be a gentle kiss instead. And there was a lot of discussion back and forth, but you see that the tunnel there is the proverbial tail that was wagging the dog, because this was funded through state funds. And although Commons was not, and it is still not, a landmark, it was deemed eligible for the National Register, and therefore, when they did the 706 review in Illinois, it was found that they were going to have a negative effect on this historic resource that was potentially could be listed on the register, and therefore they had to go through the regulatory review by IHPA. They were talking back and forth, and it was very clear that the architects didn't really get it. And we had done some work on, we'd done an HSR actually for Crown, I think prior to this, so they knew we understood preservation speak, and they got us involved, and we ended up working with the university. Halliburton and Root were the architects of record for REM, but they still had to get REM on board with what the IHPA wanted to do. I hope you can see Mies's face there. You actually, when you go there, you walk through Mies's mouth to get into the building. This is what the Commons look like inside. And so I should say that not only did they sort of have him pull back a little bit, although not as much as he might have, from the Commons building, but they also put a little more effort and respect, I would say, into how they were going to treat the Commons building, and more of a restorative approach. Here you see what it looked like prior to anything happening. There was a 7-Eleven store put in there, and the bookstore, and it was and a pizza guy that was in the middle of the center of the building, which actually was in front of where the old kitchen was. And then this is restored back. The picture on your right is, well, there's two rights, aren't there? The black and white images of the historic Commons, and the bigger images of what it looks like today. And those are actually photographs on the wall. Those aren't vents or something. So it's been returned quite almost identical to what it was originally, at least in the center of the core. And then the transparency of the building has also been restored with these glass walls that never really went away, but they were obfuscated by all the stuff that was in there. So now you can still, I mean, now you can go back and see through the building again, which was the original intent. It is similar to what you'll see at Crown in a minute. It does have these very spindly columns in the middle. But unfortunately, we had to add these, you see these large, they call them pods. I don't know if they're aliens come out of them or what, but these are for the kitchen requirements for the food service. Sodexo Foodservice has very stringent requirements on how they service. Maybe that's what you have here, but I guess students are really demanding these days. We didn't have things like this when I went to school. And we tried to beat them back into as small corner as we could get, but there were nonetheless, they had requirements that had to be met, so that was the compromise that came out. Another building that we've been a little bit involved with, we did a brief study of Carr Chapel, also fondly known as the God Box. It's a non-denominational chapel. It needs some work. It's basically just been barely maintained all these years, and it really needs a pretty good going over, although it doesn't need any, well, the storefront here needs to be rebuilt, but other than that, it needs a cleaning up. And we hope eventually they'll get a donor who will fund the restoration of this building. That's the inside. It's very simple, very, very simple, and it's his only religious structure that Mies did, I believe. Another building that is undergoing renovation, restoration, and that we're involved with a little bit is the Wishnick Hall, which was built in '46. One of the earliest buildings is part of the historic core. This and Pearlstein and Alumni Hall are the three oldest. Well, there's another one, Minerals is actually older, but of the core academic buildings, those three are the first ones. And it's being renovated to modern laboratory use. Hullibert and Root again is working on the lab part of the building. The university brought us in to work with them on preservation issues and making sure that material handling and the handling of the historic materials, I should say, not material handling, and just general, the way that things were being done there were in an appropriate fashion, even though, again, this building is not a landmark. The city had a little different view, and unfortunately there's been some fire prevention interventions that are less than what I would like to have seen, but nonetheless they're required, and they weren't willing to bend the rules because it's not a landmark. One of the things we had to do is basically we have to replace the windows. Now, I almost never would be an advocate for doing that, and we did actually look at trying to retain these windows, but unfortunately the condition, the poor detail, frankly, of the original building, I don't know how well you can see this, but if you look at this thing, it's like a roller coaster. It's a piece of steel, but it wasn't thick enough, and it is corroded. These, you can see here how there's a big wave in here, and it's spot welded in places along here, and you can see the corrosion that's built up under here. Well, the only way to fix this is to take the window out and remove this thing completely and clean the steel up. Otherwise, it'll always be a constant problem. And once you take the window out, basically, it's impossible to get it back in there again. It's an aluminum window. It wasn't made very well, and they wanted to use an insulated glass unit, and so this is a mock-up of a replacement window, custom replacement window, and you see on the left is the original, on the right is the new one, and this isn't the actual finished product because there were certain things about the sight lines here that we didn't like, so they've adjusted it and it'll actually match even closer than it already does. Inside, the whole thing is being, as I said, converted to lab space, and again, the university's been great about this, that they took an attitude of wanting to take a restorative approach rather than just a renovation, and at least in the public spaces. So the main entry lobby, this is it before, this has been very carefully tended to and restored while having to add certain features like, you see this diffuser here, in order to upgrade the HVAC system. We did leave these historic space heaters that were in the ceiling, and these are actually being used now for distribution of air. So it's like, it's a historic element. It has a slightly different use, but it's still part of the HVAC system, which I thought was pretty successful and fun to do. Because normally they just say, yank that thing out of there. It's ugly. But it was there, it was part of the story of the building, and we thought we should keep it. Over here in the corner, this you see in the distance, if you can see it that clearly from where you're standing, you can imagine what it's like when you're in front of it. It's just out of the, I try to keep it out of the picture, I should have left it in, but here's the historic firebox, and then there's like 4 times the size of that, like this big for a 3-story building that they have in there. I don't know why they have to have it, but they did. Another project that we worked on several years ago in '01, and we actually, this is the first new project that Harboe Architects is taking on, and that's Bailey Hall, which there are 3 graduate family not dorms, they're apartments for families, or married students, I guess I would say. And these are concrete frames. They were all done in 1955 and 56, and they all leak like a sieve. They're in terrible shape. They had a bad construction detail, and the water basically comes in all around that wall. So this is another situation where, unfortunately, although we did try to figure out a way to intervene here without removing all this stuff, the only way to really fix this problem is to take the entire masonry and aluminum frame windows out of there and then build it new with new flashing. The basic problem is that the flashing detail, basically doesn't have any flashing. So when it rains, the water comes in on the floor, which is not a good situation. It's been doing that for 50 years, so you can imagine the kind of toll that that's taken. But that's going to be repaired, and eventually the entire building will be renovated with new HVAC. And I didn't have a picture of it, but probably the most fun part will be restoring the lobby and the first floor terrace that's also a total disaster right now. And there are 3 of those buildings, so they hopefully will be done over the next 5 years. This is another building, one of the earliest buildings by Mies, 46 again. This is called the Engineering Research Building, which is part of a unique part of the campus at the south end is the research park, basically, from back then. It was not academic buildings, but it was research in these big loft spaces. And what was neat about this building is that this window system that you see is all wood framed, which we believe is because in 45, 46, there was a shortage of steel after the war, and so they were using wood for economics. And you can see it's under renovation. You can see what it looked like. Basically, the original windows were patterned glass, and all that almost all of it has been removed over the years. There's 1 or 2, there were like 20 pieces of original glass still left in this whole building, which was, you don't even see the whole building here. So that has been restored, and not only that, but these walls had been filled in with brick over the years. There's 4 bays here that have been, only part of it has been restored now. And so the IHPA also was involved with this because there was some grant money from them. This is in the sort of the alley space between it and another building. They allowed them to remove the original wood frames that were here and then reinstall them on this facade, which is the main facade on the west facade, restore them and reinstall them here, and then replace the original ones with metal frame aluminum windows that mimic the original ones. So this was kind of a unique situation. And then around the corner is what's known as the Chemistry Research Building, another research building. This has been a very interesting project. Canon Design is the architect. We're, again, consulting. And this will be a tax credit project. This led to, what the university did is they actually sold the building to a developer, a private developer out of Maryland, who is redeveloping it as a research park, or the first piece of a research park at that end of the campus. And then they're able to take advantage of the tax credits because we have now made the entire academic campus a National Register district, of which this building contributes. This is not a Mies building. This was done by Schmidt, Garden, and Erickson, who was a firm that did a lot of the working drawings or the construction documents for Mies. Mies would design these buildings, and they would then do the documents. They did 3 or 4 buildings on the campus. And this is the front of the building. You can see this is the south end of the campus, facing 35th Street. Across the street was Stateway Gardens, which used to be one of the worst projects in the city. It's basically all been scraped away, and now they're building low-rise, low-density, mixed-income housing across the street. 35th Street is also, is anybody here from Chicago? Are you a White Sox fan? No, quickly his hand goes down, no. Okay. Well, anyway, I'm not either, but it's okay. But U.S. Cellular is at the other end of the street. It's really 3 blocks away from the campus. So this is a zone of redevelopment. The city is pumping a lot of money into 35th Street. There's a lot of private development money that's coming there. It's a neighborhood that is really changing and becoming more of an economic engine, and they want 35th Street to be something. Well, you can see this building doesn't have much curb appeal the way that it is, and the developer had all kinds of ideas of what they wanted to do to it, to this facade, I should say. But given the fact that they wanted the tax credits, of course, they were limited in what they could do. And this sort of led to probably the most challenging situation I've ever faced in my almost 18 years of dealing with the IHPA about, you know, how far do you go on certain things. Now, the original glass in this building, and you can see some of it here, the original glass is a blue glass that is textured on the inside and etched on the outside. And this was because someone had a theory at that time about heat-absorbing glass, and this was sold, marketed and sold as heat-absorbing glass, which was supposed to lessen the load of heat on the building. Unfortunately, when you're inside there, if you're a rat, you probably don't care too much, but if you're a lab worker, it feels like you're in the deep end of the pool and someone's holding your head under the water, not letting, at least that's how I feel in there. It's not a very comfortable feeling. And these guys want to make this, you know, competitive with modern laboratory research parks that are drawing big bucks in, especially in the biomed field, which is what's going on around here. So we had long discussions about how really, I think, inhumane in a way to put people in that, but there was very strong disagreement. They insisted on having this original glass, even though you can't get this original glass, even though we couldn't get anybody to make something like it and warranty a window system with this glass in it, because nobody puts etched glass or sandblasted glass on the outside of a building in a modern window system. Nonetheless, they had to do it if they wanted to get the credits, and because the credits meant so much to the project, that's what they have done, and we'll see how it leases and we'll see how it performs, but I'm skeptical. These are mock-ups. These were where we were trying to get them to go, at least have blue glass, which was easily obtainable, but something you could see through. As I mentioned, this project led to the creation of a National Register district, which is a great step forward. The university for years was fighting this idea, oh my God, these buildings, they drive us nuts, they need work, they're falling apart, they're hard to maintain. Basically, they hated them, and because they had this decision to stay, I shouldn't be that harsh, but they did find them very troubling. And every time they would have a project, if they wanted money from the state, they'd have to comply like it was a historic district. So we got them to actually embrace it, say, take advantage of it, make it a district. They're going to treat you like one anyway, so why don't you take advantage? And they did. So now this entire academic campus is a National Register district, which is great. And now to the crown, which I'm sure is more what you wanted to hear. This is Mies's masterpiece. I'm not going to give you a whole lecture about where it came from, but clearly Schinkel was a great influence on Mies, and it is a beautifully classic design in a modernist vocabulary, and the relationship here is not coincidental. There's the building when it was basically first done, and they planted some pretty good-sized trees. Alfred Caldwell was the landscape architect, and there is also an effort right now to restore a lot of Caldwell's design for the campus. Peter Lindsay Shout is working on it. In fact, he won a ALA award for, or ASLA, sorry, ASLA award for his design of the campus. This is some of the iconic images from the time when it was first opened, and it was quite something. This was Mies's house. I mean, he was the head of the school. He thought about this idea of universal space for a really long time, and now he was able to create that and to live in it. I mean, this was the place that he wanted to inspire the next generation of architects, and in fact, it was very inspiring for many architects, which made working on it very interesting, because not only are there a lot of them around and in Chicago, but there's also a lot of them that still teach at the school, and they all seem to think they know what Mies would do if Mies was alive today. And here's another image of the glowing box. And the building had been majorly renovated in the 1970s by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. They basically replaced all the original glass with new glass, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and repainted it, and did some changes to the HVAC system, but basically the building looked like it always did. The green ivy is a big problem all over this campus. People love it because it looks beautiful, and the Miesians say, well, Mies really wanted it to be there, but unfortunately it's quite damaging. In the meantime, the building has become both a Chicago landmark and a National Historic Landmark. It was made a National Historic Landmark in, I think, 2001, which was when it was only 45 years old, which is very young for becoming an NHL. Typically, they have to be 50 years unless they have outstanding value, and this was deemed as having that, of course. And it was actually made a Chicago landmark, I think it says 97. So it was just over 40 years old. We do have some other modernist landmarks in the city, Inland Steel, 868-80. Probably the youngest one is the Daly Center that Charles Bronson did, Jacques Bronson did, Charles Bronson's the actor, Jacques Bronson, who was a Miesian, beautiful building designed with the Picasso out front. That's also a city landmark. The first thing that had to be done was to deal with the south porch because it was literally crumbling and falling apart. And Fujikawa Johnson, Joe Fujikawa, had worked with Mies. He taught with Mies. He did a lot of Mies's apartments in the 50s and 60s. And then after Mies died, he carried on the tradition. They were brought in to do this, and we were brought in to consult on preservation issues. And that project was completed within a year. Basically, we had to rebuild the whole thing. The entire structure of the terrace had completely blown apart due to corrosion. And it was very useful because it served, especially for the paint systems and so on, it served as kind of a large-scale mock-up, so we knew what we were going to be in for on the major project. One of the first things we did, and on the main building renovation, we were teamed with Crick and Sexton, who are a very hot firm in town and all over, actually, and they have won a number of AIA awards, national AIA awards. They also do sustainable design, and they were a lot of fun to work with. Both Mark Sexton and Ron Crick are graduates of IIT, so again, for them, it had a lot of personal attachment and so on. And the condition, the first thing we did was to do a full assessment of the building. Here you see the ivy not only on the outside, but actually on the inside. That's the dean's office on the lower right. And also we had this issue of corrosion breaking glass. And when they replaced all the glass, they came in, instead of using the sandblasted glass, which was the original treatment, because it had a lot of problems with getting soiled and marked up, they used a laminated glass with an inner layer, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but that created problems of its own because it was two very thin layers of glass, so there wasn't a lot of resistance to that corrosion buildup. Here you see the inside where there was condensation problems and leakage problems both, creating extensive corrosion all throughout the interior surfaces of the steel. One of the first things the team had to do was to come up with what kind of glass are we going to replace it with. Again, glass technology has changed somewhat, and actually in some ways it helped us, but we did very extensive studies of all the different kinds of ways you could recreate this original sandblasted glass. Now, Mies used sandblasted glass, he used etched glass, and he used pattern glass on campus, all in different places and all in different ways. And we don't know why he used one there or at one place or another. We just know where he did use it because there's some still left. And for example, on Wishnick, he used pattern glass. He didn't use sandblasted glass. And then on Alumni Hall, he used sandblasted glass. So he went back and forth, probably depending on cost, but maybe there were other reasons that we don't know. We decided to do full-scale mock-ups. You see the 6 lights of glass there. They're all different treatments. And we were trying to figure out what would give us the most reasonable rendition of what had been there originally, which we knew was the sandblasted glass. And you can see from the inside and the outside, they look quite different. These, on the inside, they're not that dissimilar. There is some differences, but these two lights here are these two lights here. And those are ones that have film in them. So the film not only created a different, how the glass performed, but also changed the way it looked quite dramatically. And the reason we looked at that was that there was and I'll get to this in a minute, the greening of Ground Hall, there was a desire to make the building perform better. And one of the ways you can do that, of course, is using a low emissivity film in the glass. And so we wanted to at least look at that, which we did, and it failed the look test. We also, here's an example, this is Carr Chapel, has original sandblasted glass in it, so we knew what that looked like. And then of course there's subtleties, whether the glass is green, the glass is blue, depending on what the makeup of the glass is. And here's 3 different samples trying to, one of them is etched glass and 2 are sandblasted, trying to ascertain what it is we wanted to do. And then what I hope you can see here are these grids of tape. And these are all the different ways we think that architecture students might try to do nasty things to the glass, like using magic markers and spray mount. And you guys would never do that, right? Well, these guys would. I know they would, because we see them do it all the time in there. And actually one of the hardest things to get off are those tape dots. If you leave a tape dot on sandblasted glass for about 3 weeks, it basically is impossible to get it off, or at least impossible to get the tape, the sticky stuff off. So we did this because we wanted to see how the proprietary, they wouldn't disclose what it was, but it's some kind of a sealer, epoxy sealer, that they put on the sandblasted glass to protect it. We wanted to see how it performed. And they actually gave us a 10-year warranty, which was well beyond what they would normally do. So we solved the glass problem, and then the next big problem was the stops, because in order to meet the current building code, and we had to use thicker glass for those huge lights, they're about 10 by 12 feet, and we had to use a 1/2-inch thickness of glass, float glass, in order to meet the deflection load. And in order to do that, to meet that load, we had to increase the size of the stop. So what you're seeing here, this is the original 5/8-inch thick stop, and then this is 5/8 at the outside, sloping up to 7/8. I think that's right. And no, it's not, went 5/8 to 3/4. And this was debated for weeks by probably dozens of people, and I can tell you that the Miesians hated this idea, because it was, you know, how could you do something that's non-rectilinear? And I'll also guarantee you that if you go there, you have to look really, really hard to see this at all, because your eye just doesn't pick it up. So again, doing the full-scale mock-up was able to convince the non-believers that in fact it would be okay, even if it wasn't true. At least it looked okay. So then we had all that settled, and we knew we had a very tough road ahead in the fact that we only had 15 weeks to to restore the building in the downtime that the students were gone for the summer. So they shrouded up the building, completely enclosing it, getting ready for the blasting, and then we had a smash bash on May 16th. And I don't know if you heard about this, but they auctioned off on eBay the right to be the first one to smash the glass to start the restoration. And what you see there is Dirk Lohan, Mies's grandson, and his son, Mies's great-grandson, who bought the right to do this for like $2,500 on eBay. And it was I thought, very appropriate and fitting for him to kick the thing off. And they had a huge party. It was really fun. It's a great building for an event like that. So there was a smash bash, and then the work really began, and we knew we had to be done by the 25th of August, actually the week before, because they had already arranged for the opening ceremony on the 25th of August, where all the dignitaries were coming and so on, so there wasn't any way to change that. So we had to get to work. And peeling out the glass, we just were interested to see exactly what had been going on when we took out all the stops. You can see the condition was terrible. We did a full-scale mock-up of a bay, because we wanted to test all the methodologies that were being used for the blasting and the painting and so on, and also for the sealing of the stops that were going in. So we had them do one full bay, everything as it would be at the end, and then tested it in situ water testing, and it failed. And then we had about 10 days or a week to fix it, and they did, and then they tested it again, and it passed. And it was really a matter of how the sealant was applied. It was actually leaking through the screw holes, so they used sealant in the screw holes. And it's not a perfect system, but it should perform quite well, and in fact has performed pretty well for the last, at least over the winter. We'll see how the spring rains treat it. But this idea of full-scale mock-ups was really important for the whole project, and really ended up saving a lot of time. Every step of the way had to be looked over and approved. There was a very elaborate system of rolling punch lists that we did for all the steps. There was the blasting, the priming, the second coat, and the third coat all had to be looked at. Here you see the blasted to white metal, and there's a finger pointing at some flash rusting that then they had to come back and deal with. And you see, this was all, of course, lead-based paint, so it all had to be contained and done, you know, with all the rules and regs. And this is Jan Rogatz, who is the project manager as an architect. She's with the white helmet, and can't even think of his name. I only worked with this guy every day for a year and a half, from Crick and Sexton. He was the project architect. Tim Tracy, sorry. Anyway, we had to get suited up in order to get in there to look at this stuff. This is the painter testing the mill thickness on the Tennemic. It's a Tennemic paint system, and here he is testing the thickness, making sure we're getting the coverage we want. And there's the finish coat. And I don't know how well you can see this, but one of the interesting things was that, you know, this was some little pitting, but this was probably original to the finish, mill finish for the steel, and not necessarily corrosion. There was a lot of markings all over this stuff that came out very clearly once it was cleaned up and painted, which is part of the story of the building. The U.S. Steel emblems and so on it. There was a big hiccup this has to do with the level of tolerance. I talked about the 1/8 of an inch on the stop, and here we had an issue where these screw heads had to be flush with the stop, because that was part of the design, and they basically all originally were that way. And when these guys pre-drilled all these stops, and they brought them out, and they painted them, and they put them in, all of a sudden they were countersunk too deep. And the glass guy, who was an amazing subcontractor, one of the best I've ever worked with in any trade, he saw it right away, and he was like, oh, this was like Black Friday. This was on a Friday afternoon, and everybody was really bummed out because we thought we were going to, you know, blow the schedule. They went back and they made another 250 stops, or however many, no, it was more than that. However many stops they had to make, and came out again, and they were, again, a little bit off, but they were within an acceptable tolerance. And it really had to do with the thickness of the paint, was the thing that had thrown them off. Here we are they are installing the glass. We're watching them install the glass. You can see how large these lights are, these upper lights, and they had to be lifted up and over the scaffolding. And they had about 1.5 inches space on either side where the steel mullions were to slip this thing down in there without cutting off their fingers or breaking the glass. It was quite tricky, but they got it into a real rhythm of it, and it really went along better than they had thought it would. The steel doors, the Ellison doors, were one of the few elements that are still there that were more or less original, and we felt very strongly that they needed to be retained and restored. Of course, the contractor thought, how foolish, why don't you just get new ones? They're even better now than they were in '56. And you can see the bottom had a lot of problems. They had used a mild steel structural element instead of stainless steel, which the rest of the door was made out of, so it was all rusted and blown out. That was completely restored. We did have to make 2 new thresholds, which actually had already been replaced once. So we were just replacing previously replaced elements, but the ones that were original were reused. And this is the one area where we had to actually cut out a little bit of the original steel, structural steel. This isn't working, but here, this piece here, on the face of it, as it runs down, it had suffered a lot of corrosion. They had to cut out the top of this flange, which is actually a channel, large channel, structural channel that they cut out and then welded in a new piece. That was the only place that needed structural alteration. This is the restored door. The toilet rooms were actually restored the summer before, and they had to be upgraded for ADA, and you can see that here's an ADA sink, and here's an ADA toilet, but the vocabulary was kept the same, and everything else was retained and cleaned up, and so it's basically the original toilet room. Now, for the future, as I mentioned, there's going to be the greening of Crown Hall, and there has to also be some better ADA access. At the moment, the only way to get in here is over here. There's an outdoor lift that goes down. You go in the basement, and there's a one of those chairs on the stairs thing that you come up, and that's not very it's not very acceptable. So Crick and Sexton has designed an exterior ramp that's out here away from the building. This is actually the back of the building. This is the front of the building, but this is the way everybody goes in. And there'll be the idea is that there's a ramp and then a subterranean connection under here. You go in, and then the elevator is hidden in the paneling that you saw earlier inside, so you won't be aware that there is actually an elevator in there. The greening of Crown Hall is something that Donna Robertson, the dean, is very committed to. And in fact, the building was quite green, at least in its initial concept, using natural light and ventilation to the utmost in order to provide a good environment, or what was thought to be a good environment in those days. Of course, if you ask the students that sit by those big windows, the convection that works on them in the wintertime, they're extremely cold, and in the summer they bake. So I guess they would contend that it isn't as green as it might be, but the basic premise of the building is pretty good, and you can see how he was using the penetration of the sunlight in the wintertime to help heat this dark gray floor. And that's going to be very important in the future performance of the building and trying to harvest that to some degree, both for daylight as well as for how the building gets actually cooled in the summertime. And on the picture on the left, or I'm sorry, on your right is it's just how the students use it. And actually on the other image is also the students using it. They use that center core area for pinup. But again, the universal space idea is ever present. One of the things about the conversion or the adjustments that will be made in the building is there's a huge energy savings. You see these bar charts that show what we expect the improved performance to be, largely due to the reduction of electrical requirement for the lighting. And not insignificant also is the reduction of CO2, which, as you know, is the big culprit behind global warming. So we see that as an important thing to work on. There were two consultants that were involved with this. The firms are Atelier 10 and Transolar. Transolar is a German firm, and Atelier 10 is British. They both do work in the States all over the place and teach at architecture schools, actually, in sustainable design. And they did a whole long study. I'm not going to go into all that, but just to say that this has really been looked at, and we really are optimistic about how much better this building will work. And here you see the top image is the winter time. It has a radiant system in the floor, which was original design. We had it tested. It's in good shape. It will be rezoned to perform better. And then in the summertime, they'll use it as a sort of a passive cooling, in the sense that the sunlight that hits the floor, the floor it won't be cold water, but it'll be a couple degrees less than the ambient temperature in the room. Therefore, the sun will hit the floor, and that will be drawn off, and you won't get this heat buildup that you typically get in the summertime in there. They'll also utilize, you see here, this is the natural ventilation that Mies had come up with. There are vents all around the perimeter. These are operable windows, so you get a natural cooling effect, especially if you operate them at night when the normal cycle of the day cools off, and you can flush the building out, and they intend to try to do that. We'll see how well that performs. This is going back to the issue of the inner layer here, and actually the inner layer was making both the heating and cooling of the building harder and adding to the deterioration of the glass. And the frosted glass actually, because of this idea of taking the heat away in the floor, was going to actually help it perform better than it would otherwise. They will also zone the mechanical system so it performs better, and they will use sensors so that the daylighting will be harvested. These are again, this is just a sample of the kinds of analysis that was done by these guys in order to determine what the best courses of action. This is the building. You see these elements here are the lockers. This is the center core. And this is showing the daylighting issue. And we're toying with the idea of using a new blind that will actually be reversed in its orientation to bounce light back in on the ceiling and improve the light harvesting characteristics. These are mock-ups of what we might do with that. There's discussion of even having them mechanized so that they will be in their optimum location during the right time of day. Right now they're just manual, and due to cost they may remain that way. We also are looking at lighting mock-ups, and this was a reject, but nonetheless we're trying to get back to the original look of the fixture with improved lamping, which is not hard to do these days. We'll get better light output and much more efficient energy usage. And then we're also going to reuse this system. The consultants wanted the new fancy, what's the word for it? They have these things that come down. They push the button and it goes, and the air distributes in a different way. But we're going to modify these slightly so that it doesn't do exactly the same thing, but it does nearly the same thing, and it'll perform much better, but be the original elements. So this was it after it was done. You get the sense, it's almost like the Soji screen idea, beautiful, transparent and translucent element on the inside and the outside, and the crisp black color of the paint. And what's really fun about this building is how it changes its personality over the course of the day and the course of the year, depending on how it's being used. When the students are there, it's all in a turmoil and very busy and messy. At the end of the year, they clean it all out, they clean it all up, they have a big party. It looks like it's in its tuxedo almost. It's a beautiful, pristine manifestation of that building. So it shows a lot of personality and changes of light. And this is the iconic image up in the upper left corner, and I think all we really need is a new tree there on the right, and we'll be very close to what it had been. And the hope is that if Mies could see it, or if he's looking down and seeing it, that he's pleased with how we've treated not only Crown, but are taking care of some of his other legacies on that campus. So that's it. I'll welcome any questions you might have. No questions? Yeah. Part of it, well, it really depends on what the problem is and what the building is, what's possible, what's not possible. I think for Crown, okay, Crown is up here relative to anything you do to it, how you treat it, how you think about it, what you're trying to get back to. The CRB, as it's known, it's a good context building. It's a contributing building to the district, so we have to treat it with respect for sure. But it's not by it just being kept and reused and remaining in its context. I think that's the most important part of that. And I don't think I've ever felt the way I do about those windows. I mean, the fact that they want to have the windows be in a way that is totally contrary to how that building wants to be reused. I mean, it is a rehabilitation. It's not really a restoration. And it used to be when, the whole idea of historic rehabilitation came to the fore, they allowed people, more than one would hope in those days, even then, and yet it has almost gone a little bit too far the other way on certain buildings. Now with Crown, there should be no compromise. It's an NHL. It has, you know, an important legacy. It was a lesson building for thousands of architects and other precedent. CRB is just another, you know, B modernist building. It's not a great building. It's, you know, it's important to keep it in its context, but it's not worth going to the mat for. So that's, you know, bluntly how I would approach that. That gives a different result. I think we could have captured or retained a lot of the CRB's importance and its element and how it looked and so on without making it really uncomfortable for how those people are going to be. I think we'll see how it, 5 years from now, what the result is. I think it'll look great. It'll look very much like it did, but I'm not sure that's the best point of that exercise. And the compromises that we had to make on Crown, like the paint is different, the glass is a little different, but it's really, really close. And it's as close as we could get given today's technology. And one of the big challenges on all these buildings, these modernist buildings, is how do you fix problems where the solution would have been something that's no longer possible technically, or like Bailey Hall, okay? You can't fix that without tearing it all out. It's the only way to fix it. It was badly made, so what do? You know, you try to save the important parts, and then you try to make sure that when you're done with it, it retains the essence of what made that building significant. So that's the approach. That's probably more than you wanted to hear, but yes?
So Crown was originally all painted with metal, the outside steel. It was left sort of oxidized.
The original building was, it's all steel and glass and terrazzo, and that's it. The original steel was painted with something known as Detroit graphite paint, which was heavy lead in it. Not only is it not made anymore, but even if it was made, we wouldn't be able to use it because of the legal issues of using lead-based paint on that situation. So we opted in that case for a compromise. We wanted to have the most durable paint system possible, which we thought, and there are competitors to Nemec, but basically it's a high test, you know, long multi-coated urethane-based system that is going to last. It's got a 10-year warranty, and it should last 25 years and maybe more, hopefully longer. And we took it all the way down. Now there are, you know, the thing that you worry about is the few little places that you didn't get to. But part of the reason that we were on top of it, and we were, myself or Tim Tracy were out there every day basically